G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thanks for coming along. So this is session 22. We're looking at chapter 32, verse 9, down to 33, verse 9. Nice one chapter. Now, in the last session, we finished off where Jeremiah was told to buy Hanamel's field, right? It's around about the 10th year of Zedekiah's reign, 588 to 587 BC. So we're just a year away from being taken over. What we see here, the king of Babylon's army was just outside besieging Jerusalem, and it's the second year of his siege at this point in time. Jeremiah was imprisoned in the court of the guard because he prophesied Jerusalem was going to be given into the hands of the Babylonians, and Zedekiah, king of Judah, will be taken away captive by Nebuchadnezzar down into Babylon. They didn't like this prophecy, so they thought, we'll just lock him up. That will silence him. And Zedekiah is told that he's going to fail in his revolt, which is what he's doing here. He's revolting against Nebuchadnezzar somewhere between the 9th and 11th year of Zedekiah's reign, about year 10, I guess. Yeah, 10th year. The siege here is temporarily lifted around Jerusalem because the Pharaoh Hophra from Egypt, he comes up to help Judah because they'd made an alliance before Zedekiah and Hophra. And so Egypt comes up to assist Jerusalem to defeat Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar pulls back from Jerusalem, heads off Hophra, sends him back home packing, and all the while Jeremiah is still in prison. Now, while in prison, Jeremiah receives this prophecy that Hanamel, the son of Shallum, his uncle, is going to come to him and ask Jeremiah to buy his field in Anathoth, which is where Jeremiah was from. And so Anathoth, by this time, it's outside of Jerusalem. It's already been captured, overrun by the Babylonian armies, pretty much made the land worthless at that time. But Hanamel needed some money, so he comes to Jeremiah, who is his nearest kin, or one of his kin, and he has the first option to buy this land. And so now we're going to see that Hanamel's coming authenticated this prophecy of Jehovah regarding buying this land. Okay, so we're now into the purchase. We're going to see this in chapter 32, verses 9 to 15. 9 to 12 actually deals with the procedure of buying it. In verse 9, the price of the purchase is spelled out. And I bought the field that was in Anathoth of Hanamel, my uncle's son, and weighed him the money, even 17 shekels of silver. So the field was purchased in accordance with the legal requirements of the day. Gold and silver were paid by weight. We're paying him in silver here. And a shekel weighed approximately, I don't know, 0.4 of an ounce, or around about 11 grams. The price, 17 shekels of silver, was around 7 ounces of silver, or 195 grams. We don't know how big a plot of land he bought, so we don't know whether this is a high or low price for the land. 17 shekels of silver. However, given the present situation where the Babylonians are camped on or near that very same place of land just north of Jerusalem, this would have pretty much devalued the property in Judah. Hence, it was probably a pretty cheap price. Now, remember, Jesus was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, which is the price of a dead slave. So this also shows here how the Babylonian invasion destituted the family of Jeremiah's cousin Hanamel. So he must have been pretty desperate to be selling his land. In verse 10, we have the signing of the deed. And I subscribed the deed and sealed it and called witnesses and weighed him the money in the balances. So Jeremiah now writes his name on the deed, puts his seal in it in the presence of witnesses, and he paid him the silver. And all of this is part of the customs of the day anyway. It's nothing abnormal at the moment. Verses 11 to 12, we have the filing of the deed. So I took the deed of the purchase, both that which was sealed according to the law and custom, and that which was open. So we see here 2 copies of the deed were made in accordance with the law and the customs of Israel. One deed was sealed and the other was left open. Now, both the sealed and the open copies of the deed were then given to Jeremiah. And in verse 12 is the filing, it's the filing of the deed itself. And I delivered the deed of the purchase unto Baruch, the son of Neriah, the son of Messiah, in the presence of Hanamel, my uncle's son, and in the presence of the witnesses that subscribed the deed of the purchase. So Jeremiah now hands over the deed to his scribe, Baruch. Now, this is the first time we see Baruch mentioned in Jeremiah. So he is Jeremiah's scribe, and he's going to be mentioned several more times from now on. Now, all of this was done in the presence of Hanamel and the witnesses. The witnesses subscribed the deed of purchase. It says, before all the Jews that sat in the court of the guard. So this entire symbolic action was done before witnesses, so that there'll be no doubt about its legality. And you'd rather to think, well, what's the big deal? I mean, we're going to be overrun. The land's going to be worthless. So, why bother? Well, in verses 13 to 15, we have the meaning of the symbolic act. In verse 13, and I charged Baruch before them, saying. So this is a charge to Baruch, who served as Jeremiah's scribe. And so it's before the many witnesses of verse 12. In verse 14 is a charge itself. Take these deeds, this deed of the purchase which is sealed, and this deed which is open, and put them, that's both of them, into an earthen vessel. And these earthen vessels are just like those vessels in which the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Okay? So, and the reason they were put into these earthen vessels was so that they may continue many days. And that was proved by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that proved that putting them into these earthen jars actually seals them for many days, because these Dead Sea Scrolls survive in these earthen vessels for centuries. And in verse 15, we have the interpretation of what's going on here. For thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, houses and fields and vineyards shall yet again be bought in this land. So why was Jeremiah asked to redeem Hanamel's field? It's a field that's probably worth next to nothing. So why was he asked to redeem this field by God? This was a test of faith. Jeremiah has been predicting the Babylonian destruction and devastation of the land of Judah. And they're at the door. So why would anyone in his right mind spend money to purchase a field which has been so devalued in light of what is happening, especially with the impending captivity and the exile coming? Because Jeremiah prophesied all these. However, the purchase of the field was a test of faith. Just as God's promises of the land's devastation was about to take place, so the eventual restoration will also take place. So purchasing this parcel of land, which was of little value at this time, was because of faith. Jeremiah believed in God's promises for the future. And Jeremiah believed that this same land will once again become very valuable. Now, with this symbolic act completed, with this initial interpretation, now in verses 16 to 25 is Jeremiah's prayer, considering what's just occurred. Now, in light of the approaching Babylonian armies, the prophet seems to have developed second thoughts about the wisdom of purchasing Hanamel's field. However, he acknowledged and trusted God's sovereignty and love in his prayer. And in verse 16, we have the timing of his prayer. Now, after I had delivered the deed of the purchase unto Baruch, the son of Neriah, I prayed unto Jehovah, saying, so it comes after he signed, sealed, paid for the land, and now Jeremiah prayed to Jehovah after this entire transaction was finished. And in his prayer, he tells us some wonderful things about God. In verse 17, he talks about God's omnipotence. Ah, Lord Jehovah, behold, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and by your outstretched arm. There is nothing too hard for you. So This is the God who has made the heavens and the earth by his great power and outstretched arm. And he's saying, God, there is nothing too difficult for you, nothing at all. And in verse 18, he talks about God's grace and justice. Verse 18 says, who shows loving kindness unto thousands, and recompenses the iniquity of the fathers into the bosom of their children after them. So the grace of God is seen in his chesed, C-H-E-S-E-D, meaning his steadfast goodness and loving kindness. And he shows this towards thousands. The Hebrew phrase, asar hesed, shows loving kindness, literally means to accomplish loving kindness. This goes back to Exodus chapter 20, second part of verse 5 and verse 6. Exodus 20, verse 5, I'll just read it for you. I, Jehovah, your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, upon the third and the fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing loving kindness and unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. So this Jeremiah is referring back to Exodus 20, verses 5 and 6. According to Jeremiah 32, verse 18, Jehovah's justice is manifested in the fact that he repays the sins of the fathers into the bosom of their children after them. And it's, remember, this is of those who hate him. And the greatness of God is seen in that he is the great, the mighty God. Jehovah of hosts is his name. And in verse 19, Jeremiah tells us about God's omniscience, great in counsel, mighty in work, whose eyes are open upon all the ways of the sons of men, to give everyone according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings. Jeremiah is saying that he knows everything that men do. So he's able to give to each one according to their ways, according to the fruit of their doings. And in verses 20 to 22, Jeremiah now reminisces about God's past blessings with Israel. In verse 20, he points out the blessings of God are to be found throughout Israel's history. Verse 20 says, who did set signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, even unto this day, both in Israel and among other men, and made you a name as at this day. So the mighty acts of Jehovah in the deliverance of his people from Egypt are in view here, because that's in the land of Egypt. And the signs and wonders that he used in this deliverance, as well as in the histories of other nations, this made Jehovah's name known throughout the world. In verse 21 are the blessings of the Exodus. And he didst bring forth thy people Israel out of the land of Egypt with signs and with wonders, with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm and with great terror. Jeremiah declared that Jehovah brought his people out of Egypt by 5 different means: by signs, second, by wonders, third, by a strong hand, fourth, by an outstretched arm, and fifthly, by great terror. If you ever have taken part in the Passover Haggadah, this is a retelling of the Passover story, each of these elements is ascribed to 2 plagues. 2 plagues for the signs, 2 plagues for the wonders, etc., etc. Of special importance is the phrase, with an outstretched arm. Now, back in Exodus chapter 6, verse 6, Jehovah promised his people that he would save them from slavery. Wherefore, this is what he says back in Exodus 6, verse 6. Wherefore say unto the children of Israel, I am Jehovah, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will rid you out of their bondage, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. The phrase with an outstretched arm is repeated right throughout the Hebrew Bible in connection with Passover remembrances, with an outstretched arm. Now back to verse 22 of Jeremiah 32. In verse 22, Jeremiah reminds them that there was blessing during the conquest under Joshua. God gave them this land, this promised land, which thou didst swear to their fathers to give them, a land flowing with milk and honey. So there's the blessing during the conquest under Joshua. Now, in verse 23, he turns his attention to the fact that Israel, having now entered the land, proved herself a failure. And they came in and possessed it, but they obeyed not thy voice, neither walked in thy law. They have done nothing of all that thou commanded them to do. Therefore, you have caused all this evil to come upon them. They came in and possessed. But they obeyed not the voice. They did not obey the voice of the prophets of Israel, neither did they walk in the law. They rejected both the law, the Mosaic law, and the prophets. They did nothing that the Lord commanded them to do. The result in verse 23 is that Jehovah has caused all this evil, all this calamity which came upon them. Now, having said all of this in his prayer, because remember, this is his prayer, having said all of this in his prayer, Jeremiah now comes to the point of his prayer. He spells out his problem in verses 24 to 25. He's just spoken about how God is so good and all those things. Now he comes to the crux of the matter here. Verse 24, Jerusalem is under siege and is soon to be destroyed. Behold, the mounds, they are come unto the city to take it, and the city is given into the hand of the Chaldeans that fight against it because of the sword and of the famine and of the pestilence. And what thou hast spoken has come to pass, and behold, you see it. Jeremiah says here, behold the mounds. Now, this refers to the high embankments which were made by the enemy outside the city. The embankments were made up to the city walls. And from these high embankments outside the city, the attacks upon the city by various means could then be loosed. Behold the mounds. Jeremiah already knew from what God had told him that the city would be given into the hands of the Chaldeans who were fighting against them. The city is to be destroyed by the famous triad, which we see throughout Jeremiah: the sword, the famine, and the pestilence. The sword they used outside the city walls, famine and pestilence decimated the people inside the city walls. Now, all of this is the fulfillment of prophecy. What you have spoken has happened. Behold, you see it. So in spite of the very obvious fact that Jerusalem, the land, and all around it was to be destroyed, yet in verse 25, amazingly, Jeremiah was commanded to buy a field. It was amazing in the eyes of men. The purchase is now described. You have said unto me, O Lord Jehovah, buy the field for money, and call witnesses, whereas the city is given into the hand of the Chaldeans. So Jeremiah clearly interpreted the vision he saw back in verses 6 to 7 as being a specific word of God for him. Then he states his dilemma. In light of the fact that the entire country was about to be delivered into the hand of the foreign Gentile power, why should he purchase the field? Why should he buy a field that he'll never be able to enjoy? Now, the rest of this chapter, verses 26 to 44, are God's answer for Jeremiah's prayer, his question, and his dilemma. Now, in this section, we see the destruction of Jerusalem in verses 26 to 35. God now reaffirms that which Jeremiah has already been told and what Jeremiah expressed in the closing sections of his prayer. In verse 26, then came the word of Jehovah unto Jeremiah, saying, so this is in response to verse 25, his prayer. In verse 27, God's omnipotence is reaffirmed. Jeremiah already recognized God's omnipotence in the first part of his prayer. Now he says, behold, I am Jehovah, the God of all flesh. This emphasizes his sovereignty. Is there anything too hard for me? God is asking him. Is there anything at all too hard for me? Now, if you're smart, this question demands a negative answer. God is omnipotent. No, nothing is too hard for God. Nothing at all is too hard for God. His power is going to be shown in two ways. First of all, he has the power to bring judgment upon Jerusalem. And second, he has the power to restore Jerusalem. The power to bring judgment upon Jerusalem, we'll see in verses 28 to 35, and his power to restore Jerusalem will be shown in verses 36 to 44. In verse 28 to 29, he reaffirms the fact that Jerusalem's going to fall. In verse 28, this is what he says. Therefore, thus says Jehovah, behold, I will give this city into the hand of the Chaldeans and into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he shall take it. So the city will be taken by the Chaldeans and by Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 29, the city will be destroyed. And the Chaldeans that fight against this city shall come and set the city on fire and burn it with the houses upon whose roofs they have offered incense unto Baal and poured out drink offerings unto other gods to provoke me to anger. So not only would the city be captured, but it would also be burned by the Babylonians, and the houses will be burned. Now notice here he emphasizes the houses, because why? On the rooftops, the Judeans used to offer incense to Baal and poured out drink offerings to other gods in their pagan worship. They specifically provoked God to anger on these rooftops. And this is a reaffirmation of what we saw back in Jeremiah 19, verse 13. And the houses of Jerusalem and the houses of the kings of Judah, which are defiled, shall be as a place of Topheth. Even all the houses upon whose roofs they have burned incense unto all the host of heaven and poured out drink offerings unto other gods. So we were just reaffirming here what was said back in chapter 19, verse 13. Verses 30 to 35, God lists the reasons why the fall of Jerusalem will take place. First of all, in verse 30, for the children of Israel and the children of Judah have done only that which was evil in my sight from their youth. For the children of Israel have only provoked me to anger with the work of their hands, says Jehovah. So the provocation against Jehovah dated back to Israel's youth. And through the ages, God's people have provoked God to anger with the work of their hands. The work of their hands was to make idols and to worship them. So that's the first thing, to provoke God. Second, in verse 31, for this city has been to me a provocation of mine anger and of my wrath from the day that they built it, even unto this day, that I should remove it from before my face. Now, the duration of his provocation was from the day that they built it, even unto this day. Now, we don't know exactly, we don't know the exact means or circumstances under which Jerusalem first became a city. It could have begun as a city under the Jebusites, and from that day, the city appeared to have been in a continuous provocation of God to anger. The only possible exception to this very general statement would be the time of Melchizedek. Remember Melchizedek? He was the priest and king who was a true believer in the God of Israel. However, it is unknown whether the citizens of Jerusalem followed the lead of Melchizedek. We don't know. Whatever. This provocation actually included all segments of society in verse 32. The evil of both houses of Israel provoked God to anger. All segments of society were included. It says the people, the kings, the princes, the priests, the prophets, the men of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Everybody was involved. No one was excluded. The third thing we see is in verse 33, Israel is guilty of the rejection of God. It says, and they have turned unto me the back and not the face. And though I taught them, rising up early and teaching them, yet they have not hearkened to receive instruction. So they turned their back and not their face to God. And the verse states that Israel failed to turn her face, thus showing a lack of shame. She didn't care one iota. This involved active disobedience to the Mosaic law. This was not because God did not tell them what to do, because he did. He did teach them, because it says he rose up early and taught them. And this is an expression which Jeremiah used for the prophetic voice, rising up early and teaching them. It involved, what happened here was it involved active disobedience to the law and the prophets. They didn't hearken. They didn't listen to any instruction. the people refused to receive instruction. Hebrew term for instruction here is a term musar, M-U-S-A-R, means chastening or correction, and it refers here to divine discipline. The nation refused to respond to the punishments that God had to inflict upon his people. All this while he was inflicting punishments, they said, no, we're not going to go back to God. It's good this way. And then fourth, in verse 34, but they set their abominations in the house which is called by my name to defile it. So they actually defiled the temple itself. They set up loathsome idols, abominations of the house of the Lord. Idolatry was set up in the temple compound. If you go and have a look at Ezekiel chapters 8 to 11, this shows very graphically in his book what they did. Fifth thing we see in verse 35, the destruction of Jerusalem was caused by human sacrifice in the valley of Hinnom. In the valley of Hinnom, they built altars and high places for the god Baal. They burned incense to Baal. Now if this wasn't enough, what else did they do? It says they caused their sons and daughters to pass through the fire as human sacrifices to the god Molech. God repudiates having anything to do with human sacrifice. He says, which I did not command them, nor did it come into my mind that they should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin. This is not even in the thought of God that his people would offer human sacrifices. Now, so far, what we've seen, God has merely reaffirmed to Jeremiah that Jerusalem will be destroyed. He reaffirms Jeremiah's prayer that the city is given over to the Chaldeans and reaffirms the reason why it is necessary. So far, God has not answered Jeremiah's dilemma and question. Why have you caused me to spend the little money I have to purchase a field which I'll never be able to enjoy? The specific dilemma of Jeremiah is answered in verses 36 to 44, which deal with the restoration of Jerusalem. God's power is such that he can both destroy and restore. First, he spoke about destruction, and now he speaks about restoration. In verses 36 to 44, we have the restoration. This is chapter 32. So now God begins to deal with the restoration of the city in verse 36. And he summarized what was to happen. And now, therefore, thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, concerning this city, whereof you say, it is given into the hand of the king of Babylon by the sword and by the famine and by pestilence. Jeremiah again used the triad of sword, starvation, disease to show how the city would fall. In verse 37, Jehovah made the promise that Jerusalem would be restored in the future. Behold, I will gather them out of all the countries whither I have driven them in mine anger and in my wrath, and in great indignation, and I will bring them again into this place, and I will cause them to dwell safely. So, Jehovah had driven his people into foreign lands. He had dispersed them. They were scattered there because of the anger to which they had provoked him with their unfaithfulness. However, Jehovah's purpose was to gather the exiles and bring them back. There's that they return, there's that bring them back again. That's the word shuv, S-H-U-V. That's Jeremiah's favorite word in his book, into the land where they would now dwell safely. So this verse supports the dispensational view of the scriptures because it declares that the people scattered by Jehovah would be gathered by him. And this fact demonstrates the fallacy of replacement theology. Remember, replacement theology says that the church has replaced Israel except for the curses. And the amillennial interpretation that the Babylonians literally destroyed Jerusalem, but that the regathering refers to the church. So under replacement theology, Israel gets the curses, the church gets the blessings. But that's not what we see here, because the very same city that God would judge is the city that he would bless. If physical Jerusalem was the city that God judged, then physical Jerusalem will be the city that he will bless. The result in verse 38 is that they shall be my people and I will be their God. Jeremiah used this terminology several times throughout this book. That's the point of the final restoration. The end will result in this very unique relationship. Jehovah will be Israel's only God. Israel will be God's people. That's the final restoration. And in verse 39, he deals with their salvation. And I will give them one heart and one way, that they may fear me forever, for the good of them and of their children after them. So the Hebrew term here for heart is the word lev, L-E-V, and it refers to the internal part of man, while the word way, Derek, refers to the external. So God promised to make his people internally and externally righteous. And their internal righteousness would play itself out in their holy actions, their external actions. Now, this was promised earlier back in where he spoke about the new covenant back in Jeremiah 31. And the reason is that they may fear me forever for their own good. For their own physical, material, and spiritual good, they will fear God. And this will also be for the good of their children. So back in Jeremiah 31 to 34, Jeremiah clearly says that all Jews will be saved in the kingdom. All Jewish children born in the kingdom will come to saving faith. So this good will not just extend to the first generation, but to the children as well. And the whole basis of this is the new covenant found in Jeremiah 31. Now this is dealt with in verse 40. And I will make an everlasting covenant with them, that I will not turn away from following them to do them good. And I'll put my fear in their hearts, that they may not depart from me. The new covenant is an eternal covenant. God will not turn away from doing them good. And the word shuv is used once again. The new covenant is unconditional and eternal. God will continually follow the Jewish people and the land of Israel and Jerusalem for the purpose of doing them good. This will include physical, material, and spiritual good. God will place his fear in their inward parts that they might not depart from him, as the new covenant promised in Jeremiah 31. And now it's reaffirmed here in Jeremiah 32, and it's going to result in inward righteousness. Now in verse 41, he describes the future blessings. Yes, I will rejoice over them to do them good. This includes both physical and spiritual good. And I'll plant them in this land assuredly with my whole heart and with my whole soul. Jehovah would find pleasure in his people on the day of restoration. In verse 42, it says that there will be the reversal of certain things. For thus says Jehovah, like as I have brought all this great evil upon this people, so will I bring upon them all the good that I have promised them. Notice here, the very same people to whom God brought about calamity, he will bring blessing. So it's impossible here to create a division upon any exegetical grounds. It is not accurate to say that the evil came upon the Jews and the good will come upon the church. It's not there's no division like that here. It's the same people who the calamity came upon, the good will come upon. The same people who God brought the calamity upon, those very same people, he will bring the good. Verses 43 to 44, he specifically deals with Jeremiah's dilemma now. The fields will be bought once again. In verse 43, and fields shall be bought in this land, whereof you say, it is desolate, without man or beast. It is given into the hand of the Chaldeans. So the land at this point has been desolated by the Chaldeans and has lost its value. It can be purchased for only 17 pieces of silver. However, verse 44 says that in the future, the land is going to become valuable again. Men shall buy fields for money and subscribe to deeds and seal them and call witnesses in the land of Benjamin and in the places about Jerusalem and in the cities of Judah and in the cities of the hill country, in the cities of the lowland and the cities of the south, for I'll cause their captivity to return, says Jehovah. So men will once again use that same process that Jeremiah used earlier in this chapter. Men shall buy fields for money. Men shall subscribe and seal the deed. Men shall call the witnesses, the very things that Jeremiah did, but no one else would do when Jeremiah did it. Yet Jeremiah obeyed God's command. And that very same process by which Jeremiah purchased the field of Anathoth, men will use again in the final restoration when the land becomes valuable again. Jeremiah's symbolic action is to serve as a visible object lesson here, that the land will become valuable again. What Jeremiah did in a period of devaluation, men will again do in a period of great affluence. And this is going to be true throughout the land as he begins to describe the various segments of the geography. The land of Benjamin was where Jeremiah lived. The land he purchased was in the land of Benjamin. The land round about Jerusalem, this included the hill country of Judah, hill country of Samaria, Ephraim, and the lowland of the Shephelah. Shephelah was that a region of low hills between the coastland and the hill country. It's also going to include the cities of the south or the Negev desert. And the reason is that I will cause their captivity to return. And again, Jeremiah uses the word shuv. Chapter 32 was reserved for the symbolic action of purchasing the field of Anathoth, although we're given some interpretive clues regarding it. Jeremiah 33, 1 to 26 will deal with the interpretation of the symbolic action. Yeah, the interpretation of the symbolic action, we're going to see, it's going to divide it up into 4 sections. We're only going to see the first section. First 9 verses will revisit the topic of Jerusalem's restoration. In verses 10 to 11, promise of the return of peace and joy to Jerusalem. Verses 12 to 13 deal with flocks that will flourish once again. And then the chapter ends in verses 14 to 26 with a reconfirmation of the Davidic covenant and the Levitical priesthood. Okay, let's look at the first section, which is the restoration of Jerusalem, found in verses 1 to 9. In verse 1 is the occasion. Moreover, the word of Jehovah came unto Jeremiah the second time while he was yet shut up in the court of the guard, saying. So the first time the word of Jehovah came was in Jeremiah 32:1. The second time is here in chapter 33:1, and he was still shut up in the court of the guard. Now, verses 1 to 9 are linked back to chapter 32. In verses 2 to 3, there's a call to try God. In verse 2, he's the Lord over all the earth, including Israel. Thus says Jehovah that doeth it, Jehovah that formed it to establish it, Jehovah is his name. So Jehovah is the covenant-keeping God. The God of Israel decrees something to be done, and that decree works its way out until it accomplishes its purpose. The word will not return to God void or empty-handed. It will work out its way. In verse 3, we have the admonition. Call unto me, and I will answer you, and I will show you great things and difficult, which thou know not. So the admonition here is to call upon God, and he will answer them and tell them about great things that they could not comprehend by themselves. They just couldn't fathom it if they're so great. And in verses 4 to 5, he turns their attention to the present judgment of Jerusalem. In verse 4, he describes the attempted defense of the city. For thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, concerning the houses of this city, and concerning the houses of the kings of Judah, which are broken down to make a defense against the mounds and against the sword. So the houses of the people and the king in Jerusalem were destroyed, right? The people destroyed them, and the rubble was used to make defensive mounds against the Babylonians. In verse 5, the Chaldeans are breaking through to fill these houses with dead bodies. While men come to fight with the Chaldeans and to fill them with the dead bodies of men, whom I have slain in mine anger and in my wrath. Although these bodies are being slain directly by the sword of the Chaldeans, they're indirectly being slain by God who brought about the judgment. And for all whose wickedness I have hid my face from this city. The reason for God's judgment upon the nation was because of the evilness of his people. In verses 6 to 9, in contrast to the present judgment of Jerusalem, there is the future blessing of Jerusalem. Future blessing of Jerusalem means several things. First of all, in verse 6, there is the restoration of health. Behold, I will bring it health and cure, and I will cure them, and I will reveal unto them abundance of peace and truth. God will bring health and healing to Jerusalem. Second, there'll be the return from the captivity in verse 7, and it would include both houses of Israel. I will cause the captivity of Judah and the captivity of Israel to return, and will build them as at the first. So God will cause them, Judah and Israel, to return. Again, we have the word shuv. God will then rebuild them as at the first. Third, it also means the future forgiveness of sin in verse 8. And I will cleanse them from all their iniquity, whereby they have sinned against me, and I will pardon all their iniquities, whereby they have sinned against me, and whereby they have transgressed against me. Now here we see three different words for sin used. The word iniquity, or avon, is used twice. It's used in the singular and then in the plural. The word sin or sinned is chatah. It's also used chatah, and this term refers to the missing of the mark. And if you're going to miss the correct mark, means you're going to hit the wrong mark. And then the word transgression means it means to violate a specific commandment, and the word pashar is used. So in this context, it has to do with the breaking of the Mosaic law. So three different words are used to describe the sinfulness of Israel. However, the sinfulness of Israel will be forgiven in the future. Now, the results of forgiveness in Jerusalem are clearly stated now in verse 9. And this city shall be to me for a name for joy, for a praise and for a glory before all the nations of the earth. Jerusalem shall become a name of joy before God. Jerusalem shall be a praise of joy, honor, and glory before all the Gentile nations of the earth. The Gentile nations of the earth shall hear all the good things that I do unto them, as they once heard of all the calamity that God brought upon Israel. Now, these Gentile nations, when they hear the good that God shall do for Israel, shall fear and tremble. Why? The Gentiles will fear and tremble for the good, for the peace, and for the prosperity that he'll provide for Israel. But they're going to tremble because when God restores the peace and prosperity of Israel, it's about that time that will come, the judgment upon the Gentile nation. So that's why they will fear and tremble. And that is our lot for this session. Study hard and grace on.